Hello, I'm delighted to be joined by Charanjeev Bamrah, who is an architect for Fosters and Partner. We're going to begin this short interview just asking you a little bit more about what your role is at Fosters and what kind of projects you work on, just to get a sense of what's happening now for you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Adrienne. It's obviously always a pleasure to be able to have these chats and to give a little bit back to sort of upcoming architects and also give a little bit more on some of our experiences. At the moment, for Foster and Partners, I am currently involved on confidential project, but I think I can share the location, which is in the Middle East, and it's quite a large scale scheme. Previously, I have worked on a set of residential apartments in Dubai, and uh, uh, previous to that, I worked on luxury hospitality project in Saudi. So yeah, the focus is a lot at the moment. We're tending to win a lot of work out in the Middle East, which has its pros and cons. Good thing about working for a practice like Foster's is there's always a great focus on professionalism and advocating for the very best and excellence in architecture, which aligns very well with RIBA. So I think the part three course especially, and so before that, part one and part two, sort of helps you gear yourself into that thinking of what your output is, what you want your output to be in the real world in terms of giving back and what sort of level of commitment to the profession is. So it's been quite positive.
And so working on projects like that at your stage in your career, what does that actually look like?
It's yeah, it's a lot of, I think, because of the logistics around working on an international project that's quite far away. I think communication is key to start with because we're communicating with large teams across the world. We also have offices based out there, so we don't necessarily need to be sort of traveling back and forth all the time. It's more about liaising with colleagues, liaising with wider team members. And I think in today's world, that's much easier, especially just the way we're having this conversation directly over Teams. It's quite helpful that we have all of the technology to assist us in that sense. And in our profession, I think the set of drawings actually becomes the language that you're communicating with a lot of the time. So understanding how to document projects and how to draw is kind of a key process with that.
And for a big project like this in the Middle East, I mean, how many colleagues are you working with? You know, what sort of team size are we talking about here?
It's quite a large scheme that we're on,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of we're in the hundreds on this project, but not necessarily always working together because it's split up into different phases of the project or the parts of the project. Um, so on a daily sort of interaction, I'm with a team of about 20, which at that scale is much more manageable. And then eventually we will have sort of catch ups with the larger team just to ensure that everyone is liaising and communicating quite well. And there's a lot of talk about actually keeping consistency within across the board. So there's a lot of effort in that sense. So yeah, I think teamwork and communication is sort of the number one factor, yeah, on a large scheme like that.
I can imagine. And thinking about so working for Fosters and Partners now. So you've obviously completed your part three a while ago. Can you tell me a little bit more? I'm going to ask two questions at once, which I know you're not never supposed to do, but thinking about the process, the transition from through your part one and part two to part three, sort of just thoughts on, I guess, what that process was like for you, and included in that, I guess, how your role has evolved in terms of the responsibilities, the kind of ownership you have, that just what's changed over this really well-known progression to professional accreditation?
I think one thing that's been consistent is that engagement with design has been quite invigorating from part one up until now, which is great. However, I find the more you progress, maybe potentially the less you touch on design. I think primarily because there's a larger focus on the professional kind of deliverables and requirements of large scale projects, and that more times falls into the contractual side of a project, whereas when you're sort of younger, you're not so maybe you're not so aware, or it's maybe not the focus on, say, if you're a part one graduate, because we all know that 80% or 90% of part one graduates are looking forward to the next step, which would be going back to university and starting their part two. So it's much simpler even for task management to be given a design exercise, because coming out of part one, you're most likely to be much more with grasps with your design side than looking at contracts, and actually in all honesty, that is a bit more boring, especially when you're younger. So you've probably, I mean, I know at part one I was much happier taking care of design package, or sort of being engaged with that, rather than sort of looking at what sort of drawings we need and what scales, and are we meet our contractual obligations. That tends to happen a more sort of as you're a bit more senior in the project.
So are you moving away? It kind of feels like you're talking about sort of a helicopter view. The more experienced and senior you become in your career, you're moving further and further away from that sort of design process. But that doesn't mean that you lose design from your role.
I think it's just more about sitting in the team, really, because yeah, the sort of the further on you get, somebody needs to be engaged with that process, and more times that's also a process that's engaged with client side, and then if you've got sort of a larger team, and say you've got part ones and part twos on the project, it's quite nice to give them a bit more of responsibility and roles to do, and especially in Foster and Partners, because we're very much a design led or design focused practice. I think it's actually quite nice that a lot of responsibility is given to sort of younger staff members, and yeah, I think it's a natural progression that if somebody else is not able to apply all their time on design, then for example myself, I would spend a little bit of time on design, but also take care maybe of packages going out for construction and technical reviews and so on. And a lot more of it is actually just coordination internally and externally, and we have following our IBA, actually, we have a strong quality control process internally, which takes a lot of time aside, and that is primarily a design process. But yeah, somebody like myself will be a bit more engaged with preparing information for that and presenting.
Fantastic. So those students who are thinking now about their part one applications, what would your advice be to them in terms of I guess how they prepare themselves properly, how they submit strong and persuasive applications to get that first step on the REBA ladder?
When we say part one applications, is it for the undergraduate course?
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, just that embarking on that process. I guess the process needs to be the same at every stage. You're just demonstrating more as you progress. But what makes somebody notice your application?
I think for the part one, especially for myself, is because you're so sort of young in your actually you're quite young in your professional life. The main thing was sort of actually showcasing what you really enjoy, because a course like architecture is so wide and broad. There's no necessarily correct way of doing it or correct ingredients. that I found. So it was more a case of showcasing what my strengths were, and that ultimately feeds into architecture. And it's so multifaceted that it feeds in from one direction or the other, and it doesn't mean that one way in is the same for 100 people. Everybody could be very different, and actually that's the beauty about architecture, is that even within our teams we notice that everybody's got a certain strength, and they can sort of fit nicely with a certain role on a project. um, and I see it the same as when you're starting off for part one. Actually, just play to your own strengths, and naturally you'll find your way. You'll find what architecture has for you and what you can learn from it and what you can give, and vice versa.
And I don't know whether you're involved in recruitment directly in your current role, but when you're thinking about applying to architecture firms, what's looked for? You're talking about having a kind of almost a clarity of what the strengths are, but in terms of how that's presented in portfolios and CVs, what to avoid, what would you say is best practice?
Yeah, it's always quite tricky. I'm not actively engaged with recruitment. However, I can speak from experience when I have been attending interviews, and especially my interview here. Um, there is a tricky sort of balance with architecture, because there's a professionalism that you want to communicate, and there's also a creative aspect that you want to create. And I've always found that the way your CV sticks out is demonstrating your creative aspect, but in a very personal manner. So it's quite a lot of people talk about seeing a personality of a person come through in an architectural CV, but I've always found actually that's one of the most challenging things to communicate, especially when you come, say, from a practice that's got a set way of working. So you definitely, I think it's really worthwhile putting your own spin on things. It might be a piece of work that you've worked on for a practice, but you've changed it in your way for the better. And that's worth communicating in your CV. And unfortunately, it does need to be short and sweet, because it needs to grab someone's attention just enough for them to be inquisitive about you as a person and your work. And that's when you sort of go in for the interview. So yeah, I don't know if that summarizes it, but short and sweet, but expressive of your personality in a sense.
I guess there's a challenge there, isn't there? When you're expressing your personality, you're talking about that in a design sense or in a content sense, or a bit of both.
Yeah, I'd say primarily, because we all know the output is design and architecture.
Mhm.
Or maybe even, if you're a very technical person, that could also shine through. So there is a context of what you're applying for. I mean, it could not necessarily be a direct architectural role. It could be, like a technical aspect within an architectural practice. But what makes you strong? And the way I always think of it, and the way we actually work in practice a lot, is we always think of, we're still drawing. Say we're drawing a facade, right? But ultimately, somebody else is going to look at that drawing, and if it's a very legible drawing and it's well represented and looks generally beautiful, then I think somebody has applied a lot of attention and detail to create that. So you could definitely communicate that in your job applications and on your CV, on your little portfolio samples that goes along with that. I think for reference, I always tend to do very short CV as a cover. So I try and do one A4 sheet, and then I attach a few samples of work to go with it, just to demonstrate my previous experience, on my take on what is correct.
So it's just enough to catch the attention, just enough to think that's an interesting person. I like the approach that they're taking, but
Yeah,
there's integrity to the design concept in the work that they're presenting.
yeah, and I think you've hit the ball on the head there. I think the use of the word integrity is quite a good way of summarizing it.
Thinking back to your first degree in architecture and studying at university, were there things that you were involved in sort of outside of your course, or things that you really focused on in your course that you think, you would recommend, you would for early careers, you'd say do more of this?
Yeah, tricky question actually. I think when I look back, one of the things that I wished I spent more time on was maybe volunteering a bit more, which I didn't do enough of in my first degree
Mm-hmm.
or in my undergrad. And also competitions. I think competitions are great because you are sort of, firstly, you're showing initiative by yourself. You're showing that you're able to think outside the box and go for something that is outside of your curriculum at university. So that's very strong. Um, and also you get to, whatever you're proposing, the competition is 100% you. It's not influenced by, or there's not much influence coming externally to push you in a certain direction. So in a sense, your proposals or your responses to a competition brief are very pure of yourself. And I think when you're young, that's a really good way of exploring yourself and also exploring architecture a little bit more and playing with things, and then might come back to inform your academic work or your professional work. So it's a fun way of doing it, and it's really well accepted in professional. I think academically and in practice, people tend to praise it quite a lot.
That's a really lovely idea. And when you say volunteering, are you just talking about something general, or you're talking about something specific to the profession?
I think because of the depth and how wide architecture spans, it's not limited to even the construction industry or the built environment. It could be anything, because as we all know, if you've got a bit more self growth, it always comes back to help you in work in general. And it's quite a nice thing to show actually at part one, because going back a few years now, going back to when I did part one, I remember going in to university, and the job prospects were great coming out. However, we also got hit by, so during my part one, we got hit by our recession. And when I came out, there was sort of no jobs available, and it was quite tricky actually to sort of find yourself useful. But when we all came back to do part two, actually, it was incredible speaking to some of my peers and my colleagues as to what they spent the year out doing. And there was no sort of right answer or wrong answer. It's just that everybody came back and had gained a new skill set. And I thought that was fascinating, because we all started off part one together in the same direction, but when we came back for part two, we all came back as completely different people, which is great.
And I guess anything that you're working with clients, you're working with colleagues, you're constantly problem solving, you're having to maintain technical skills, but also, there's I guess anything that you're doing that gets you out and gets you engaging and understanding the perspective or drivers of an organization or a group of individuals in a volunteering setting or whatever. It's all adding to that, as you say, that richness, that maturing, I guess, of kind of being out there and learning who you are and learning what you're good at.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, sometimes we forget we also need good communication skills, to work in teams, to work with people and clients, and you might not have that from day one, but it's something you can develop, and there's other ways of doing it outside of your studies. And
Fantastic. Yeah. Thinking about the industry at the moment, you talked there about, you graduated into the recession, and I remember that well. It was a desperate kind of 18 months, 2 years, for graduates. That was a pivot point for many industries. We've got other pivot points, particularly I'm thinking about sustainability and thinking about vernacular in construction. And so I'm just wondering, what would you say for younger entrants into the profession? What should they be paying attention to in the industry? What are people talking about? What are the drivers? What are the threats?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question to answer, because there's no right answer for that, and of course I don't have many answers. If um, because I think in career wise I'm still young in my career and there's still a lot to learn. But one thing is for sure is that if you're dedicated to a cause, then you'll definitely start to develop your own mechanisms to understand what it's all about and what's required and what the history is and what's the future. And when you have that attention to detail to one aspect, you can you can be the specialist at that, and you can bring that to the table wherever you are. So for example, we sort of sustainability has become a bit of a buzzword in the last 15 years, right? But we all know there's been practices who've been acting and designing sustainably for a long time, for decades. And I think maybe Norman's probably one type of person who's been looking at that for a long time. um, and you can achieve it in different ways. It can be ways of, you know, making a structure more efficient. So in today's language, we would say actually you're embodying less carbon in it, and it's got an impact that it might reduce your construction cost as well. But if you have that nature to generally question things to start with, and find the resolutions, and maybe you have a love of steel. We don't necessarily say that we shouldn't build in steel anymore. Actually, we should be smart with how we build in steel, is the answer. So I think it goes back to what your personal interests are in. If you're really interested in something, I think by all means there's always a capacity to understand it more and to learn more about it. And then there's always a way to bring it to the construction industry, because the construction industry in some ways is quite slow to change, but actually there's a lot of room for innovation, and we're looking at that constantly. So like with carbon credits, with energy use, there's always room for improvement. And you can it's not one answer is the fix. It's, I think, a lot of little bits that plug in, and you need a lot of little specialists everywhere. So there's always a little niche to go into, and as long as you enjoy it, I think that's where you'll just develop the knowledge and slot in. And a lot of practices value that, actually, as if you can demonstrate that this is what I know, this is I'm knowledgeable, what I'm aware about, you will find a practice that will really value that in you.
So almost how I'm hearing that is, okay, we'll go back to your first image of, kind of designing a beautiful facade. What will help you is not just thinking about what that facade looks like, but thinking about the materials, the processes, the impact um, of that design, and trying to sort of dig that little bit deeper, and I guess, I mean, understanding of how the design and the materials interact is architecture,
Yeah.
but actually having the drive, the interest at a young point in your career, an early point in your career, to kind of go, I want to understand that better, or I want to think about how those materials might work in a particular design aesthetic. Or am I making that more complicated than it was?
Not necessarily. Yeah, I think you're actually exposing a little bit of what we do, which is great. It's yeah, facade can be, let's say, for an example of the facade, right? A facade always consists of components, and how you construct those components, or how you compose those components to become the facade, is kind of the fundamental question, right? And whether you sort of have everything locally sourced within, I don't know, 3 miles of your scheme, which would have actually been quite normal in the old days. For example, the old brick houses in London, I think there's stories of firing brick in the backyard, and from the soil taken from the site, and used that for your facade. Or in today's world, sort of, we're shipping maybe components from Germany across, um, which some people might say is actually a very unsustainable thing to do. But in some ways, if that ship is coming anyway, and you're loading it with a few components of something very special that you can't do it here under the same circumstances, and maybe we're saying it's going to last, say 200 years, then we might find that it's the correct thing to do for what we're trying to achieve. So whether you have thorough knowledge of the method of brick construction or a composite construction, I think that's where you could sort of step in and assist, or it could be an area to learn. A lot of things we do as an architectural practice, we're sort of stepping into the unknown a lot of times, and we have to do a lot of learning before we actually find the solution. And in those senses, there's a lot of collaborative thinking across disciplines, across teams, across practices. So I don't know if that answers your question in that sense, but
yeah, I think it does. The word that comes to mind is curiosity.
yeah,
You're a curious bunch. With that, because it's that sense of exploring and being open to opportunities, but also how does that work? How will that work? So that there has to be an innate curiosity, which I guess needs to be taken up to project level as well, because actually you're the person now who is making sure that actually it probably will work, and on time, and preferably on budget.
Yeah, and I think when you start looking at sort of the part 3 level of that, when you're, say, principal, if say theoretically there's a principal architect on board, it's the principal architect's responsibility to have the right consultants, and that's where it's assembling the right knowledge to be able to deliver a project under the right timescale and the right budget, and actually the right response for a contextualized scheme. So I think when you have general curiosity on board, and everybody's not afraid of learning a little bit more and brings their sort of knowledge to the table, then you have the kind of the best environment to give you the best solution that you can for the problem at hand.
Which is great, because they're qualities that you can develop in the studio at university, aren't they? That's where that kind of foundation of attitude almost is nurtured, or should be nurtured.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why you stepped, or that was part of the reason why I personally stepped into university, was to, I think, never being satisfied with the knowledge I have. There's always a chance to learn more, and it's still to this day is, I think, part of the reason why I find it so interesting coming to work every day, is there's a lot more to learn, and every day is a new challenge, and you never know what you're going to come home with in terms of solution, or more problems in terms of that require more solutions.
Fantastic. I'm very aware that you've got a building to go and sort out. I just wanted to kind of, I guess, wrap up with, could you summarize your advice to the generation coming through after you? What would you say the older, not that much older, but the older Charanjeev would say to the younger?
Yeah, I think having seen what I've seen over the last few years, there is always room for improvement, but don't be shy to start, because you have to start somewhere, and don't be shy of, or don't be obsessed by perfecting something, because actually you, by starting and getting something on the board, that's where the greatest ideas come from their raw kind of emergent state, and then any step from there is kind of perfection, and not perfecting, but sort of reiterating it, which is known in architecture, and also really be true about what interests yourself as an individual, because I think that's what keeps you going a lot of the time. You will, in sort of architecture, I think in the professional world in general, there's always different challenges, but if you're engaged into the profession or academia, with a specific direction that's very personal to you, then I think it makes it more fun stepping through the hurdles, because you know ultimately there's an interest that's very personal to yourself that you want to pursue further, and you want to learn more, or you want to even give back more because maybe you've got a really good specialism in it. I think a lot of it's been maybe something that's mistaken, but there's a lot of respect and a lot of value for those kind of things where a specialist is required. It's just sometimes you might not be in the right place at the right time, which is quite common, and then eventually you'll find your way and you'll never think of it ever again.
Fantastic. That's a lovely place to say thank you very much for taking some time out today and talking to me. And good luck with the project you're working on at the moment. And I hope one day soon we'll be able to welcome you back to Cambridge to come and speak with our students.
No, thank you very much for having me as well. It's quite a pleasure.
Fantastic. Thanks, Charanjeev.
No problem.